Vice Chair.
Hi, MJ.
Hi, nice to see you. Over the last year or so, I think we've all seen you field a lot of questions about this disconnect between what you describe as a strong economy versus the people's generally pessimistic economic outlook. I just wondered, and it's related to the last question, what would you say is the reason that there wasn't enough of an improvement in people's economic outlook by election day? I assume you've had some time to reflect on the results of the election.
It seems clear, if you look not just at our election, but at elections and approval ratings across the globe, that not just inflation, because by the time the election came along, inflation was back down within distance of 2%. So it was back down close to the Fed's target. So not inflation, but the price level, the cumulative impact of inflation. So the fact that people could still remember what things used to cost, that was a force that really whacked incumbents in I think virtually every election we've seen across the globe. So that was a very powerful force. Now look, from our perspective, we needed to do two things. We needed to get inflation down because you'll never get people will never be able to acclimate to the higher price level unless inflation comes back down to around 2%. And that was behind our work on unsnarling supply chains, which became very important in this space. One of the graphics that I like to tout from our CEA team is if you look at supply chain measures of stress, which go way up and way down in the pandemic and post-pandemic, and you plot them against commodities goods inflation, they track each other very closely with a bit of a lag. And so getting inflation back down to target was very much an important part of agenda. But that just means prices are rising more slowly. It doesn't mean they're falling. And in fact, to have a broad decline in the price level, you would need a deep recession that nobody wants. So what you need to happen is for incomes to catch up. Now, those dynamics were happening. They were occurring. And I've spoken about this from the podium before. I theorized, probably a couple of years ago, and one of my colleagues and I are trying to write an academic paper about this. I theorized a couple of years ago that if inflation came down and people had enough time to acclimate to the new price level, an acclimation that would be very much aided, and in fact was essentially, had to be aided by rising real wages or incomes, eventually they'd start to get acclimated and to feel better. And sort of what's the word I want? Sort of a trivial example of that is when I started driving, gas was 60 cents a gallon. But I don't walk around annoyed that gas isn't 60 cents a gallon because while prices have gone up, incomes have gone up more. That's where we are. Inflation is back down. The price level remains too high from the perspective of consumers and voters. And that's partly, a big part of the answer to your question. I sense you want to say something else.
This long memory that people have
Yes.
on price levels. I mean, do you feel like you, the president's economic team, the president himself, could have done anything differently over the last few years to better address that, better, sort of meet people where they are? I mean, you've known that that is where people's heads have been at for a while.
The question of could you have done something different and better, I always feel like, sure, you could always, nobody's perfect, and you can always improve on what you did. But on the issues I'm talking to you about, we were one of the first folks to be talking about this, to be understanding the difference between inflation and price levels from people's perspective. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but I brought this to our senior staff one day. I brought this, I think it might have been the only time I did this. I brought a handout to our senior staff and said, let me talk to you about the difference between inflation and the price level and how people feel about that. And economics doesn't think that much about the price level. It thinks a lot about inflation, and not at all a critique of the mandate of the Fed. That's the congressional mandate and the one they follow. But it's full employment and stable inflation. So, and you'll hear Chair Powell talk about that. That I recognize the price level is a stress to people, but my job is to get inflation down. So it's something we've been on for a long time, and it's behind the cost-cutting work that we tried to do here. We cut costs in healthcare. The president talked today about junk fees. You saw the energy results from the SPRO release and so on. We tried to get a lot more competition going in the grocery sector, where there's definitely not enough competition, leading to pretty high markups and profit levels that we've talked about and used the bully pulpit to convey our are concerned about. But, you know, we live in a capitalist economy, and so prices are generally determined by private markets. But where we could, and healthcare is a great example because the government is in 9% of the healthcare market. So healthcare is about 18% of GDP, about half of that is the government. So there's an area where we could and did make a huge difference. Insulin, capping prescription drugs, which kicks in, by the way, in a couple of weeks, the $2,000 cap on prescription drugs. We're very proud of that agenda. You know, could we have done more or talked about it differently? You know, I think we did what we could.